of Oracle WebLogic Server Administration. So this session is specifically based on the request of many engineers that I have received so far, which is specifically based on the JMS resource targeting. That means whenever we configure the JMS, and then we have to configure the multiple resources inside the JMS, like we configure the persistent store, then JMS server, then queues, and then distributed queues, topics, and then we configure the sub deployment. Okay, so the question was that many times or you can say most of the times we get confused about the targets, where exactly we should target. If I'm creating a queue, or if I'm creating a distributed queue, or JMS server, where exactly need to target to directly to the managed servers, directly to the JMS servers, or directly to the clusters. Okay, and because multiple time that we receive the errors when we do the targeting of the multiple JMS resources. So this is specifically depend on the kind of a configuration that you are doing for the JMS. Okay, if you will not follow the JMS rules, which is specifically designed for the queues and topics, okay, then you will get this kind of errors. But if the concept is clear for you, then you will not get certain this kind of error, because you will follow the right process for the configuration of JMS resources. Okay, so for that one, I am going to show you the targeting of the queue, and then for distributed queue, and this will be same as in for topic and distributed topic. So whatever the things that I am defining for queue or distributed queue, it will be applicable for topic and distributed topic as well. Okay, so let us consider a two node architecture. Suppose we have a two managed server, managed server 1 and 2. So this I'm talking about the queue configuration. Okay, so if we have a two managed servers, so when we go for the configuration of the JMS resources, so first we define a persistent store, right, which is the actual storage of your messages that is received in the JMS. So if you have a two managed server, then we define the two persistent store, because the persistent store is dedicated for each and every server. Okay, so for example, if we have defined PS1 for managed server 1 and we have defined PS2 for managed server 2, okay, and then what we do, we create the two different JMS servers for each and every managed server. For example, we have created a JMS server 1 for managed server 1 and JMS server 2 for managed server 2. Okay, and then we do the targeting. We target the JMS server 1 to JMS managed server 1 and JMS server 2 to managed server 2. Okay, this is I'm talking about the queue configuration. So there we can have the managed server 1 and managed server 2 in the cluster. Okay, but when we are doing the targeting of our JMS servers, and if we are configuring the queue, then make sure you are doing a one-to-one mapping of the JMS server with the managed server. So once you will select the target for your JMS server in the drop box, you may see the option of cluster as well, okay, along with the managed server. But if you are seeing the option of cluster in the Dropbox, that doesn't mean the queue configuration will get supported for the cluster. Okay, because you are going to configure the queue, then you have to make sure that during the selecting the target for your JMS server, you are selecting the corresponding managed server. If you will select the target here and then you will go for the queue configuration, then it will get failed. Once you will go to target your queue to the JMS server, it will get failed, because your JMS server is targeted to the multiple managed servers. Okay, and then you will not able to configure your queue. So in that case, you have to make sure whenever you are going for a queue configuration, create a dedicated JMS server and target that dedicated JMS server to the specific managed server, not to the cluster. Okay. And once this is done, you have to configure a JMS module. So this JMS module we target to the cluster. Why we target it to the cluster? Because JMS module is a collection of the all of the resources that we configure in a domain. Okay, so there could be multiple JMS modules for multiple applications, but when we talk about the JMS module of a specific application, then there could be a requirement that multiple resources that we are configuring inside the JMS module, it could be targeted to the managed servers, or it could be targeted to the cluster based on the configuration that we are doing. So when we configure the JMS module, okay, we have a target always as a cluster. Now, first thing that we configure after creating the JMS module is first we create a connection factory. So connection factory is used by the application to create a connection with the JMS services. Okay. For example, if you have application which is deployed on the WebLogic server in the same domain, or it could be on a different domain. Okay. And when this application will try to connect to your JMS system in the WebLogic, okay, so to reach to the JMS system, for example, it is trying to read the message from a queue, or it is trying to write the message to a queue. So before doing any operation, it will first connect with the JMS system, and to connect with the JMS system, it uses the connection factory. Okay, so this connection factory is common across the applications. Okay, more than 99% of time, this connection factory is common across all of the applications, right? Because this is just used to create the connection with the JMS connection factory. It is not specific to any queue or topic or any specific distributed queue or distributed topic. So this is a generic configuration. So we target the connection factory to our cluster always, so that our all of the JMS resources that has been targeted to the clusters or the application deployed on the cluster can access this particular connection factory, right? And then we create a sub deployment because now we are doing a configuration of queue, and for queue I said that you have a dedicated mapping between the JMS server and managed server. You can't target the JMS server to cluster, so we have to create a separate sub deployment for the different queue which is going to target to separate JMS server. Okay, so this is the same in conjunction with the targeting system that we configured for the JMS server. So JMS server mapping with the particular managed server. Similarly, if you are defining the queues, then you have to define the queue and targeting of that particular queue to the corresponding JMS server. So here we have created a one sub deployment with the name sub deployment 1, and this sub deployment will be targeted to the JMS server 1. Okay, and then you can create a queue, and that queue can be assigned to the sub deployment 1. So now because our sub deployment 1 is targeted to the JMS server 1, so the queue that will you configure and assign to the sub deployment 1, it will automatically be available for the JMS server 1. Similarly, for the JMS server 2, you have to create a sub deployment 2. It is, let me correct it. Okay, it should not be 1, it should be 2, and this is 2. Let me save it. Okay, and let me go back to the same screen. So now we have to create a sub deployment 2 which will target to JMS server 2, and then we have to create a queue 2 which will be target, which we assign to sub deployment 2, right? So in same way this queue will be available for the JMS server 2. Okay, and now if we conclude the architecture in a nutshell for a queue configuration, so we have to create a dedicated JMS server for each and every managed server. Okay, because this is a singleton service and one-to-one mapping is there between the queue. So one JMS server will be targeted to only one managed server, and for each JMS server you will have a corresponding persistent store. Then connection factory is common, which is required by the application to create the connection to the JMS system. So connection factory will be targeted to your cluster. And now because there is a one-to-one mapping for the queue along of the JMS server with the managed server, so we have to create a queue which will be available only for one JMS server. If you will try to if you will go for the configuration of Q1 and you will try to configure it for JMS server 1 and JMS server 2, it will not allow. You will not get that option. Okay, so you have to select only one JMS server when you target the queue. So that means for simplification, we create a sub deployment so that we can have a multiple resources can be grouped in a single sub deployment. Okay, and then we create a queue and then we assign that queue our sub deployment, and where sub deployment is targeted to your JMS server. So this is the architecture of a queue. Okay, now if we talk about the distributed queue, so let's talk about the same architecture we have seen for the queue. We have two managed server in a cluster, managed server 1 and managed server 2. Okay, and then we have created a persistent store 1, which we have targeted to JMS server 1. Okay, and then the same persistent store 2, which we have targeted to the JMS server 2. Okay, so now this is a distributed queue. So distributed queue is a concept which is used in the WebLogic JMS for the JMS clustering. It allows the JMS clustering. Okay, so in that case, you can define the target for your persistent store to the cluster. Okay, because your distributed queue support the cluster. Okay, so persistent store can be targeted to your JMS server one-to-one mapping, or it can be directly targeted to the cluster as well. Okay, and next when we target the JMS server, so what we have seen in case of a queue, we have to target the JMS server to individual queue, right? But when we talk about a distributed queue, so you can target your JMS server to the directly to the cluster, not to the individual server. Okay, so now what is the difference we have seen here so far in comparison with the queue and distributed queue is that you can, when we create the persistent store, you can target the persistent store to your either to JMS server directly or to the cluster. And when we create the JMS server, okay, you can directly configure or you can directly target the JMS server to the cluster instead of one-to-one mapping between the managed server. Then go for the creation of JMS module. Then create a connection factory and deploy or target it to the cluster so that it can be applicable, accessible for each and every applications. Now, instead of creating the separate queue, what we have seen in the queue architecture, here we are going to create a distributed queue, right? So that means we have to create a single sub deployment. We don't need to create a two different sub deployment for the distributed queue. You have to create a one sub deployment And then you can target that particular sub deployment either through JMS server 1 or JMS server 2 or to a directly to the cluster. As a best practice, you can target your sub deployment to each and every JMS server. Okay, and then you can create a distributed queue, and then that distributed queue assigned to the sub deployment. Okay, so now if we conclude the targeting system of a queue and a distributed queue, in the queue we have targeted the JMS server to each and every managed server individually, and then we have created a separate sub deployment because the queue that we are going to create, that queue is also with the one-to-one mapping with the JMS server. But when we talk about the distributed queue, we target everything to the cluster. For example, the position store, JMS server, connections factory, JMS module. And then when we create the distributed queue, for that we create a sub deployment which we can target either to the cluster or to the each and every JMS server. Okay, and this is the difference between queue and distributed queue and the targeting system. And one thing you have to make sure, the persistence store will be dedicated for each JMS server. Okay, so however we are targeting the distributed queue to the cluster or to the multiple JMS server, but when we do the configuration of the persistence store, then we define a dedicated persistence store for each and every JMS server. That means even though it is a single distributed queue, but the persistent store for each and every JMS server will be separate for each server. Okay, and this distributed queue will automatically create a dedicated queue for each and every JMS server. So in the queue model, we have manually created a queue which we have targeted to the JMS server one-to-one. But now when we talk about the distributed queue, so we have only one distributed queue, but it will automatically take care of creation of the individual queue for each and every JMS server, which will be accessible from any server, so that it can be available as a high availability, and it is the supporting architecture of the JMS cluster. So let me quickly show you the configuration as well in the WebLogic. Okay, so first we will do the queue configuration. Okay, so first we will configure a persistent store, and then we will configure a JMS server, and we'll target JMS server to manage server. Then we create a JMS module, then connection factory, which will target to cluster, and then we create a queue, okay, which will be part of the sub deployment. Okay, so let me go to the JMS configuration. So this is my WebLogic console. Okay, so first thing is we have to configure the persistent store. So for that, go up to services. Inside services, we have to click on the persistent stores. Okay, let me take a look and edit, and then let me create a first file store base. Okay, so I will take the name as file store default 0. Okay, and this is the directory we have to specify where the messages will get saved. Okay, so this is the actual file path in your host machine or directory where the message will be stored. If you will not specify any path, the default path will be the inside the server root directory. Right, inside the domain you will have a folder called servers. Inside that you will have a folder with the name of manage server, which will you are going to target this JMS this store. Okay, and then inside that it will automatically create a default folder. Okay, and click on next. So for target we are going to target it to the manage server 1. Okay, so select the manage server 1 and then click on finish. Okay, so if I go back to this architecture, this PS1 we have targeted to JMS server 1. So that means we are actually targeting it to MS1. Okay, but because our PS persistent store is the repository of the messages. Okay, and JMS server is the logical entity. So we defined the relation as the one-to-one mapping between PS1 and the JMS server 1. Okay, so now we have created one persistent store, right? And now let me go to messaging and then let me configure a JMS server. So let me click, I will go with the default name JMS server 01, click on next. So here we have to assign the persistent store to this particular JMS server, right? So that means we are getting a drop box. That means only one persistent store can be targeted to only one JMS server. So this is a physical repository, and that's why this PS1 here is targeted to JMS server 1, because this is a one-to-one mapping between both. Okay. So let me click on next. Here we have to select the target for the JMS server. Okay. So let me select the manage server 1 and let me click on finish. Okay, and let me activate the changes. Right, so now we have one JMS server is there. Okay, and one persistent store is there, which is pointing to this particular JMS server, and both your persistent store and your JMS store is targeted to manage server. Okay, so this is the first part we have completed. We have a managed server, we have created a one persistent store, we have created one JMS server, we have mapped this persistent store to this particular JMS server, and we have targeted this JMS server to the managed server, right? And next we have to go for the configuration of the JMS module. So click on JMS module, take login, edit, new. I will go with the default name, system module 01. Click next. And now, as I said, JMS module is a logical entity for all of the resources, JMS resources, and out of all resources, some of may be deployed to the particular JMS server, some of the maybe to the multiple JMS server if it is a distributed queue, right? And then connection factory. So grouping of the JMS server, we design a JMS module as logical entity for each and every JMS resources, and this could be related to a particular application. So that means there could be multiple JMS module specific to each and every application. So what I will do, I will target it to the cluster. Okay, and then it is saying, would you like to add resources to JMS module? I'm not going to add any resource as of now. So click on finish. Okay, let me activate the changes. So we have one JMS module is created with the name of system module 0. So we have configured the JMS module, right? And then we have to configure a connection factory inside the JMS module. So let me click on the JMS module. Okay, and here let me take the lock and edit again. So click on new, select connection factory. Next, okay, I will go with the default name, and this is the JNDI name. So this is very important configuration because your application look up for this connection factory with the help of JNDI name. So whatever the name that you are going to specify here, okay, this will need to be defined inside your code. Okay, so for example, I have given JNDI, JN and then DI slash connection factory. So this has to make sure that this code is defined inside the your code as well. When your application will look up for the JMS subsystem, okay, for connectivity, it will look for this particular JNDI of this particular connection factory. Okay, and then click on next. Okay, the target will be the cluster, and then click on finish, and then activate the changes. Okay, so now we have one connection factory which we have targeted to the cluster. Okay, and if you would like to configure it to a particular sub deployment, then you can do it for as well. Okay, you can assign it to the sub deployment as well, because as I said, sub deployment is a further grouping of the resources inside JMS module. So you can define this connection factory inside the sub module as well. Okay, so now we have configured the connection factory which we have targeted to the cluster, right? And now we are going to have a connection, create a queue. So let me take a lock and edit again, and let me take a new, and I'm selecting as a queue. So we are going to configuration for a queue. Click on next, define a name, and then here we have to define the GNDI for the queue. Okay, so make sure again, just like the connection factory GNDI, this is the same GNDI where your application will look for the queue. Okay, so your application will connect to this particular queue which we are going to create here with the help of this GNDI. Okay, so this will be defined inside your code. Click next. So here we don't have any sub module as of now, so you can click on new sub deployment. Okay, and give it a name. Let me give it a name, Q1 sub deployment SD, and let me click on OK. Okay, and now I have selected the sub deployment which we have created, and now here we have to define the target for this one, for this sub deployment. So target will be JMS server 0. Okay, so click on finish, and then activate the changes. So now here you can see that queue is created. This is the JNDI name, and this is the sub deployment name, and this is targeted to the JMS server 0, right? So this is the first part we have completed, and let me go to second part as well for this one. So let me quickly go to the persistent stores, and let me look and edit, and let me create a new store. I will go with the default name. Target, I will select the manage server 2, and then click on finish. Okay, again, similarly, I will go to JMS server. I will create a JMS server for this particular persistent store. For this one again, I have to select the persistent store. So I will select the second one which we have created for second one, and then select the manage server 2, and then click on finish. So now again we have JMS server is second JMS server is created for manage server 2, which is associated with the persistent store with the name file store -1. Let's activate the changes. Right, so now we have this part is completed, and now I will go to JMS module. So I will configure the resources inside same JMS module. So for this queue as well, whatever the application going to use this particular queue which we are going to configure, it will use the same connection factory. because this is targeted to the cluster. Okay, and it can be common across the applications. So that means we have to create a second queue for this configuration, right? So let's take a log and edit. Click on new and select the queue option. Click on next. I will go with the default name Q1 and then GNDI I will define as GNDI/Q2, right? And then here we have to select a sub deployment. So here, because this is going to target to the second JMS server, so I will create a new sub deployment here with the name Q2 SD. Okay, and then here I will select the JMS server one, which is the for manage server 2. Now you can see that a queue you can target to only one JMS server. Okay, this is a toggle button. That means you can't select two JMS server for a single queue, right? And in comparison with the distributed queue, when we will go for the configuration of a distributed queue, which is a concept for the high availability, right? So that distributed queue we can target to a cluster. That means we can target the distributed to multiple JMS servers. So in that case, this option will be completely different. Okay, so in case of a queue, you can only select the one JMS server which is associated with a particular queue, and click on finish and activate the changes. So now here you can see that we have a two managed servers in the cluster. We have created the two persistent stores. Okay, and then corresponding to that we have a two JMS servers. After that we have created a JMS module. Inside JMS module we have created a connection factory which we have targeted to the cluster, and then we have created two queues. The first queue for JMS server 1 and second queue for JMS server 2. And during the configuration, we see that when we target the queues to the JMS server, we get only to target it to only one managed server. That means you can't target the queue to the multiple JMS server. Okay. Now, if I will try to target my JMS server to the cluster, then what will happen? Let me show you. So these are my JMS servers. And as I said, in this particular slide, there is a one-to-one mapping between the JMS server and the managed server. Similarly, you have one-to-one mapping between the queue and the JMS server. That means you can't deploy a queue to multiple JMS servers, right? So now if I will try to change the target of any of the JMS server to the cluster, what will happen? This will give me an error, right? Because if I will try to change this JMS server target to the cluster, that means I am trying to target this particular queue to two JMS servers, to two managed servers, right? So which is not possible. Let me show you. If I try to save it, you will see this error. Okay, the sub deployment queue is a JMS module 0 contain a standalone queue topic or quota that can be targeted to single non-clustered JMS server. Okay, so this also shows that in the queue architecture, we can target JMS server to only one managed server, and similarly, one queue can be targeted to only one JMS server. Now let me show you the configuration of distributed queue as well. Okay, so here what I said earlier is that whatever the resources that we configure, we target it to the cluster, and instead of creating two different queues and two different sub deployment for each JMS server, we will create only one distributed queue that we will target to the multiple JMS servers. Okay, so let me go to my console and let me go to the persistent stores and let me quickly create two persistent stores. Okay, and I will target it to the cluster, right? The first one is created. Let's create second one as well and target it to the cluster. Okay, and then activate. So we have two file store based persistent store is created, which we targeted to the cluster, right? In the queue, we have targeted to the managed servers. Similarly, let's go to JMS server and we quickly create two JMS servers. The first JMS server, and we will assign it to file store 0. Next, and then we will target it to the cluster. Finish. Create new second JMS server. Persistent store the second one. Okay, target is the cluster, and then click on finish and then activate changes. So we have two persistent stores and corresponding to JMS server has been created. And now we are all the resources we have targeted to the cluster, right? Now go to the JMS module section, create a new JMS module. Let me go with the default name, selectness, and I will give a target as a cluster. Next, I will not going to add any resources as of now. Let me click on finish and activate the changes. So my JMS module is created. Click on JMS module, take the lock and edit. So now we will configure a connection factory, right? So select the connection factory, click next. I will go with the default name next, and I will select the default one. It is the target for the connection factory, and then click on finish, and then activate the changes. So now here you can see that one connection factory is created. Okay, and now I will click lock and edit, and then what I will do, I will create a distributed queue here. Okay, then click next. I will go with the default name. Okay, then click on next. And here you can see the default target has been taken in a cluster for this particular distributed queue. So now if you read here, if you do not want to accept the default target, then click on advanced targeting to use the sub deployment mechanism to target this resources, and use this page to view the accept default target when the JMS resource will be targeted. The default target are based on the parent JMS system module target. So that means for distributed queue, whatever the target we have defined for the JMS module will be selected as a default target. So we have selected the uh, cluster for the JMS module. So it has automatically selected the cluster for the distributed queue. If you would like to change that one, you would like to deploy it to specific JMS servers, not to the complete target, then you have option, you can select the advanced targeting. Okay, and this I have explained here as well. When we create the distributed queue, okay, either you can target it to the cluster or either to all of the servers that are running in the cluster, or maybe to certain cluster, depend on the requirement. So now if I go here and if I click on advanced targeting, I don't have any sub deployment here, so I can create a sub deployment. Let me go with the default name. Okay, and now here you can see that you can select the JMS server, and you have option to select the multiple JMS server. So when we have configured the queue, this option was completely different. It was toggle button. That means you were able to select only one JMS server, because one queue is only targeted to one JMS server. But when we talk about the distributed queue, okay, you can target distributed queue to the multiple JMS server. Same distributed queue, we can target to multiple JMS server. So here what we have done, let me show you again this one. So by default, when we went to the target screen of my distributed queue, the default target has been selected as a cluster. If you would like to change it, okay, most of the time we go with the cluster only, default cluster only. In certain cases, you may have a requirement that you would like to have a distributed queue part of certain JMS services, then you can select from here. Okay, otherwise there is no difference. If you are going to select all of the JMS server running in your cluster, or if you are going to select the complete cluster as a deployment, then there is no difference in that. Okay, so activate the changes. Okay, so now you can see we have one connection factory, and now instead of two queues, we have only one distributed queue, right? Which we have targeted to two JMS servers. So if I click on my distributed queue, and if I click on the monitoring, then you can see that here the distributed queue has been created based on the JMS servers we have. For each and every JMS server, there is a queue, separate queue has been automatically created for you, right? So this is how we configure the and target the different resources for the JMS module distributed queue. And this is how we define the different targeting for the different resources in the WebLogic Server JMS subsystem. Thank you.